This right here is the Tamron 70-300 for the Nikon Z mount. And as a landscape photographer, this is a really interesting lens because if it's one of a kind, Nikon doesn't have a lens like this. So in today's episode, we're going to be reviewing this lens as a landscape photographer. So stick around and let's talk about that in this video. What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back with another video, and today we've got a review of this Tamron 70-300 for the Nikon Z mount. And I'm very excited to make this review because over the past month, I've done some extensive testing with this lens, gone on many shoots, and I have some full final conclusions to make about this lens. And in my previous videos about this lens, I have made some claims that there have been some issues with this lens that I've had, and that's something I really want to address in today's video because there have been some revelations and some workarounds that I have found to make this lens a lot more usable than I initially thought. So with that being said, we're going to jump in and talk about ergonomics and image quality in particular. And within image quality, we're going to talk about the focal length as well as the focal range. So let's jump right in and get right to it and talk about ergonomics. So one main thing about this lens is that it is quite big. It is definitely bigger than my 24-200, which results in a lot of space being taken up in my bag. So this is kind of obvious because this is 100 millimeters longer than my 24-200. But when I'm comparing telephoto lenses, that is definitely something I have to take into account. And when I'm out there hiking on landscape shoots and I'm packing for these long trips, I want to make sure that my gear is as lightweight and minimalistic as possible. And this lens is just a little bit bigger than what I'm used to for sure. But with that being said, it is very lightweight. You know, it's not the heaviest lens on earth because it is definitely made of plastic. And I feel like overall, it helps to reduce that weight, make it a much easier lens to carry around, quite frankly. But because it is very lightweight, that means that we do have a very plastic build in this lens. Now, I have found that this lens actually holds up quite well. I don't feel like it's gonna have an issue in terms of the body taking damage or any of that sort of stuff. So honestly, I think you'll be fine when picking up this lens in terms of durability. One thing I really like about this lens is the fact that it has a metal mount, and around that metal mount is a weather sealing gasket. So this is great because as landscape photographers, we're out there in the conditions where there might be rain or seawater or snow and other elements that might get into the lens, but we don't have to really worry about it here because it has weather sealing. This isn't something I talked about in my previous videos, but something that I've come to notice and really think this is a great part about this lens. But with that being said, there is no AF or MF switch, and for me, because I shoot a lot of video, this is really important, going between manual focus and autofocus, because I'm autofocusing for video, but then for stills I'm taking on the manual focus side of things. And that's just something that I feel like is a slight inconvenience, but you just go into the settings and kind of change it. But one thing I really wish this lens had is a locking mechanism, because the 24-200 has a locking mechanism, and when it's in my bag, I don't have to have a fear that it's gonna move around very much and extend or whatever, so it kind of keeps it in place. This doesn't have that here, so that's a little bit unfortunate. And the other thing I really want to talk about is the zooming rings and the focus ring. So the zooming ring is not the smoothest ring in the world, and this is mainly due because it's plastic. So when we're zooming, it's not super smooth and it makes it slightly harder to get the pinpoint exact focal length that you want. And the same can kind of be said about the manual focus ring, not the smoothest ring on earth. And it just makes it a little bit more difficult to get that pinpoint accurate manual focus. And for me, I actually did miss manual focus once on this shoot. I don't know if that's because of the lens, but that definitely does not help when trying to get that manual focus. So overall, in terms of ergonomics, I don't think this is a badly built lens. I do think that it has really good construction. I think it's gonna hold up. There's just some features that are missing, like the locking mechanism, the AF switch, and just the manual focus and the focus ring. And I just wish the zooming ring and the manual focus ring were a little bit smoother to make it that much easier to get pinpoint focus and exact focal length you want, but it is what it is. Overall, I think ergonomics wise, it is fine. So now let's jump right into image quality. And this is something that I kind of harped on a lot more. I was a little bit harsher on this lens. And I will say, this lens is very sharp. There is definitely no problem with sharpness with this lens. And as I've shot more photos, I really feel like the colors as well as the micro contrast had begun to show. The first shoot that I did, it was kind of a very odd scenario in terms of the lighting. So I don't think that was necessarily a fair way to judge this lens, but I think honestly, colors, contrast, and sharpness is perfectly fine. The great part is that there's pretty much zero vignetting issues, especially at f8, where a lot of that cleans up. I've even shot the photos at wide open at f4.8 and really haven't got too many issues, so vignetting definitely isn't something you should be worrying about. And overall, it's actually a pretty good lens in terms of its optical performance. But something that I wish this lens did was just have a little bit brighter of an aperture. It's a 4.5 to a 6.3, and now you would think in landscape photography this wouldn't really matter, but I actually care a lot more about the aperture for telephoto lenses over your wide angles. Mainly because when I'm shooting with a telephoto lens, I will be shooting a lot more panoramas. And when I'm shooting panoramas and the light is down and pretty dark, we're gonna wanna boost up that aperture, make it as wide as possible so we can get as much light in to increase our shutter speed and ensure that none of the photos that you're taking in the panorama are unsharp. That's the last thing we want. So having the f6.3 at the long end as well as the 4.5 at the widest definitely is not something that is beneficial for panoramas, but it is what it is. Would have loved to see something like a 4.5 to a 5.6. But I think if you were to increase the aperture, this would have made it a bigger lens, and it's already not the smallest lens on earth, so that is just something that you would have to trade off. But now let's talk about the focal range, because I think that's a focal point of this lens. So having a 70-300 is really crucial for landscape photographers. This is like your standard zoom telephoto lens for landscape photography, and this lens obviously has it. Now Nikon doesn't have a lens like this in their lineup. The closest thing that they have is a 24-200, which shaves off an extra 100 millimeters at the long end. And if you really want a lens that is able to get out there and zoom that far out, that isn't this lens, it would have to be the 100-400, and that's 2 times the weight and almost 2 times the size of this lens. So this is really a one-of-a-kind lens for landscape photographers. No other lens of the Nikon Z system has this focal range, and honestly I'm quite surprised Nikon hasn't come out with their own version of this lens. So having that 70-300 is a fantastic range for landscape photographers, and I can't stress that enough. Pair with a wide angle, you're really able to capture things that are in the far out distance. Being at 300 millimeters, you can really capture everything and help to isolate certain subject matters in the landscape. And that's so important, especially for a lens like this, whose entire purpose is to capture those and isolate those telephoto side of things. So I think this is a fantastic focal length, and I really enjoy the focal length aspect of this lens for sure, because the last time I used a lens like this was my 50-250 with my Nikon Z6, and that's a crop sensor lens, and this is a full frame lens. And this is really something I think a lot of landscape photographers will like, having that extra 100 millimeters on the long end. But now let's address the elephant in the room, the thing that I've been talking about this entire time when it comes to this lens, and the main issue that I've had. And in my last video, I kind of mentioned that when you're shooting this specifically in vertical orientation and you're zoomed out and you're at a 1/5 of a shutter speed, with the mechanical shutter, there's actually shutter shock that's introduced, which results in a decrease in sharpness in this lens. Now, I've done a lot more extensive testing, and here's what I found. First of all, like I kind of want to reiterate, this is only an issue in vertical orientation. I'm honestly not sure why, but it is what it is. And second of all, the issues really start to happen around 1/5 of a second, and it's around that range. But here's the thing, once you get past 1/5 of a second to around a second and longer shutter speeds, it doesn't actually affect the shutter shock when it comes to this lens. And I'm honestly not sure why. I've done a lot of photos and really try to test it and make sure I'm not just tripping out or anything, but that is just something to note, right? Like, we don't have these issues past 1 second, which is honestly kind of odd. But I have found a workaround with this lens when it comes to the 1/5 of a second kind of problem. You can shoot all your photos in electronic shutter, and this is gonna result in a decrease in dynamic range. But what we can do instead is actually create an HDR. So what this involves is taking 5 different photos of the same composition and with different exposures, and then putting it all into post-production, and then using some sort of software like Lightroom can do this very easily, creating an HDR that gives you almost infinite dynamic range. So this really solves the dynamic range issue that the silent shutter or the electronic shutter is going to have, and which this lens can kind of work around. But at the end of the day, it is still a workaround, meaning that this lens has imperfections, and you might be asking yourself, why does this happen? And the main reason why is because this lens does not have vibration reduction or image stabilization. Now, you wouldn't think that this is a problem for telephoto lenses, but this lens in particular, it is, because we can zoom out so far to 300 millimeters. And when you're out that far and you're shooting at 1/5 of a shutter speed, you really need that vibration reduction to come into play and to help mitigate those issues of shutter shock. And now the whole silent shutter and HDR thing only works when the subject matter that you're shooting is not moving and the elements in the actual composition aren't moving. For example, this would be really hard to do with fast moving water and so forth. But when you're shooting things like isolating certain points in the background or mountains and all that sort of stuff, this lens can actually be just fine because we can create those HDRs and reduce the effects that a electronic shutter will have when it comes to dynamic range. So with this lens, it's really interesting. It's an interesting story because image quality wise, it's just fine. It's just that one issue when it comes to the shutter shock being a problem in vertical orientation at 1/5 of a second, but there are workarounds. It's really up to you to decide how much of a risk this really is and how detrimental it's gonna be for your landscape photography. And I mean, the workaround that is for this lens to get around that issue is definitely really good. And for me, honestly, I think it's a perfect workaround, but at the end of the day, it is still a workaround. And that's something that you're gonna have to decide when deciding whether to pick up a lens like this or not. So with that being said, let's jump right into the conclusion. And this is a very tricky lens to recommend because this is competing against the 24-200, which I absolutely love. I mean, having that extra 24-70 range at the wide end is absolutely insane to me, but you are shaving off an extra 100mm at the long end. So you really need to decide, okay, does it make sense to go with the 70-300, which might not necessarily be the best build quality, is a lot bigger than the 24-200, and overall might be a less superior product than the 24-200, but is that focal range really worth enough for you to make those trade-offs? Now, this really is not a bad lens at all. I think image quality wise, when you're getting those images sharp, they're very good. They're very sharp, nice contrast, nice colors, and overall you come out with great images. But it really is that workaround at the 1/5 of a second in vertical orientation that might be an issue for some. And Nikon does not have a 70-300, which to me does not make sense. I mean, that's a lens that a lot of photographers would really want, and they just don't have it. And this is the only lens available for the Nikon Z system that is a 70-300. And for landscape photographers, this might be the lens that you were waiting for Nikon to come out with that has already been out with Tamron. So if you really, really, really want that extra range and you want that 70-300 focal length, this might be the lens to get. I mean, you don't want to settle for something that you're not going to really enjoy, like a 24-200, if you really want that extra 100mm on the long end. But overall, the 24-200 is still a superior lens over this lens. But again, it just comes down to the focal length and what you really want as a landscape photographer. Overall, it's really not a bad lens. I just wish it had image stabilization, and honestly, if it had image stabilization, I could really recommend this lens and it would be neck and neck with the 24-200, but it is what it is. And yeah, that's just a decision they decided to make. So anyways, guys, let me know what you think about this lens down in the comment section down below. Is this a lens that you would consider picking up? Let me know. And anyways, guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.